We open with the death of Jacob Mackenzie, the chieftain of Clan Mackenzie of Castle Leoch. Ellen, his daughter, sits beside his body, weeping over this loss. Later, Mrs. Fitz helps Ellen dress for the funeral. Jacob never named a successor, although her brothers, Dougal and Colum, will undoubtedly battle over the lairdship. Then we flash back to a time when Jacob gave Ellen a special brooch, along with the Mackenzie plaid normally worn by men. It's abundantly clear that Ellen was his favorite child. He vows she'll never have to marry for the clan. In the present, though, Mrs. Fitz broaches the subject of marriage. It might be an inevitability for Ellen with her father gone. Ellen refuses to discuss this on the day they bury Jacob. During the funeral, we meet Ellen's sisters, Jocasta and Janet. Jocasta remarks that their father died as he lived while on top of a maid. It's a stain on the family name. Dougal and Colum join the proceedings. After this, the clan walks through the Highlands, singing in Gaelic, as they carry Jacob to his final resting place. Jocasta tells Janet that, as married women, surely they should take precedence in the funeral procession. Ellen is with her brothers, ahead of them. Of course, her sisters know that she was always the favorite. Ellen has another flashback to her and her dad playing chess. She asks him if she's next on the marriage chopping block. Is she a problem to be solved? Jacob reveals he ensured Ned taught her and her brothers chess because it forces you to plan ahead. It's great practice for being a laird. He admits that Ellen will never be a laird, though. However, she will always light his way. Ellen means torch in Greek, after all. Later, a band of thieves tries to steal cattle from the Mackenzies. Dougal and his crew besiege the enemy from all sides. He even cuts off a few fingers from the leader as a warning. After this, Dougal, Colum, and Ned chat about the event. They wonder who attempted to swipe the cows, the Frasers, the Grants. It could be either clan. Ned adds that, with Jacob gone, their enemies would be more than happy to see to their demise, if anything, for the abundant grazing lands alone. Colum asks Ned if he knows which way the clan is leaning regarding his claim to the lairdship or Dougal's. Ned knows Jacob didn't name an heir, and most of the clans and Tannists aren't sure who to choose between the two. After this, Colum calls Dougal out for being too rash, too eager to exact violence. He lacks the aptitude for diplomacy. Dougal fires back that Colum can't walk straight. Next, we're outside Castle Leathers of the Clan Fraser of Lovat. Murtagh tries to persuade Brian to attend the Mackenzie gathering with him. Sure, the Mackenzies hate their guts, and Brian's dad loathed Jacob, but it'll all be worth it for the lassies. You gotta do it for the lassies. Davina calls them in for supper. Lord Lovat, a.k.a. Simon Fraser, graces them with his presence. Lovat celebrates Jacob's death. After all, he's responsible for stripping Lovat of his title and lands. Lovat learns about Murtagh's decision to attend the gathering. Murtagh explains his desire to pay his respects to the elder Miss Mackenzie and her sisters. However, Lovat has a different idea in mind. He wants Murtagh to spy on the Mackenzies for him. Lovat urges Murtagh to take Brian with him. Then, dinner arrives. A new maid serves Lovat. It's Julia Moriston, Claire's mother. Lovat grabs her arm, intending to do something untoward. Brian stops him, claiming this new maid doesn't know his ways yet. Davina watches from afar. When Julia returns to the kitchen, Davina reminds her not to be in the laird's presence without her. It's for her protection. Later, Ellen and Colum walk through the grounds as the clan prepares for the gathering. Ellen voices her support for Colum to become the next laird of Clan Mackenzie. Next, the festivities begin. After playing what looks like a cross between hockey and lacrosse, Dougal gets it on with a redhead. Tiny Angus and Rupert observe the coitus through a crack in the door. Ned catches them and sends them on their way. Ned asks Dougal through the door that when he's finished, he must oblige Colum with his presence. After this, Dougal and Colum have another chat. Colum urges Dougal to let him be laird. He's more suited for it anyway. Dougal doesn't want that responsibility. He's more keen on swinging swords and sleeping around. Dougal isn't willing to budge, though. He still wants to be laird as much as Colum. Outside, Ellen and Colum run into a man, James McKinn, who tries to woo Ellen. At the same time, Brian and Murtagh arrive at the gathering. Murtagh spies Ellen from afar and looks utterly smitten with her. Murdaugh runs into his aunt, Mrs. Fitz. She discourages her nephew from pursuing Ellen. She's out of his league. Also, there are her brothers to contend with. Meanwhile, Brian excels at axe throwing, much to the disdain of a member of Clan Mackenzie. The man doesn't recognize Brian, noting he's never seen hair as dark as the latter's in his life. Brian excuses himself, but the man and his pals give chase. Brian decides to hide in the stables until the coast is clear. It's here, in the stables, where Brian meets Ellen. However, neither reveals their names. Brian asks Ellen to meet him at the bridge during the Tinchel hunt. After they part ways, Dougal, Colum, and Ned welcome the Grants to the gathering, spearheaded by Isaac, the laird. The Grants are very, very rich, and they have the carriage to prove it. A young arch-bug is among them. Malcolm, Isaac's son, carries a torch for Ellen. Ned meets an Englishman, a Sassenach, with the Grants. It's Henry Beauchamp, Claire's father. Ned's curious about how Henry wound up with the Grants in Scotland. Henry insists he's a Grant by name now. Ned proposes a bond of friendship between the clans to alleviate the tension. Then he asks Henry what happened to his predecessor. Henry explains that the man departed for the American colonies in the interest of the laird. Henry is now the advisor and scribe, the bladier, for the Grants. He met Malcolm in Inverness, and the rest is history. After this, Ned relays what he learned to Colum. He doesn't believe the Grants were behind the raid on the cattle. Next, the tinkle commences. Murtaugh watches Ellen as she makes a beeline for Castle Leoch. Jocasta clocks his interest in her. However, he joins the hunt instead of pursuing her. He asks Ellen if he can accompany her back to the castle. She insists she's fine. She's not feeling well and wishes to retire to her quarters. But Malcolm walks alongside her anyway until she retreats into the castle. After this, Ellen moves through the tunnels, winding up on the road far outside the castle. She heads for the bridge to meet Brian. Malcolm spots her from a distance, realizing she lied to him. He decides it's high time the Grants return home. There's nothing here for him anyway. Then, Brian and Ellen reunite near the bridge. Ellen remarks that it's peculiar they're here without a chaperone. Brian proposes that the bridge is their chaperone. They properly introduce themselves, and it's here that they learn they're from opposing clans. So it's a Romeo and Juliet situation, especially since they've decided to keep seeing each other. They're in love, and they don't care who knows it. Later, the hunters return to the gathering with a boar. Jocasta approaches Murtaugh while he washes his hands. She offers him a cloth. Then she comments on his attraction to Ellen. Jocasta is used to standing in her shadow. Murtaugh replies that he doesn't know any Mackenzies who live in the shadows. Meanwhile, Dougal and Colum ask Mrs. Fitz if she's seen Ellen. She discloses that some saw her with Malcolm Grant. Dougal looks incensed. He takes a crew to search the roads for Ellen and the Grants. Colum essentially eggs Dougal on, and Ned clocks it instantly. Ned pulls Colum aside, remarking that riling Dougal up could get him killed or piss off the Grants. Colum does the equivalent of a shrug. In either case, 'tis another problem solved. Elsewhere, Dougal and the others attack the Grants on the road. Henry gets a couple of swings in. Dougal beats the snot out of Malcolm, who reveals that Ellen isn't with them. As the Grants resume their journey home, Malcolm insists the clan won't forget this. The Mackenzies better watch their backs. Ellen returns home, and naturally, her brothers are irritated. Where was she? Ellen refuses to divulge her whereabouts. We flash back to another memory with Ellen and Jacob. Ellen asks her father why he hasn't selected a successor yet. Jacob explains that Colum and Dougal each have what the other lacks. However, neither is really suited to be laird. After this, Colum and Ned discuss next steps. Colum lit the fuse. He riled up Dougal, who assaulted the Grants. Now, Colum must put out the fire. By doing this, he will prove to the clan that he's the rightful laird. The conversation pivots to buttering up the Grants with a gift. Colum suggests one of marriage, Ellen and Malcolm. Ned reminds Colum that Jacob swore Ellen wouldn't have to marry for the clan. Now, we're in the 20th century, the 1920s. Henry and Julia hop in their car for a drive through the country. They talk about Claire and how she's doing with Uncle Lamb. We learn that Julia is pregnant. Claire will be a big sister. Suddenly, Henry swerves upon seeing a stag in the road. He takes them off-road before the car hits a rock. The vehicle flips, sending Henry and Julia flying out of it. They land in a nearby river. Julia clambers to shore, with Henry hot on her heels. After the initial shock wears off, they begin their trek back to civilization. Later, our pair stops for a spell near Craigna-Dun. Julia ventures up the hill to get the lay of the land where the stones are. When Julia doesn't respond to his calls, Henry races to the stones to find her gone. Second episode begins on the Battle of Passchendaele in Belgium during World War I, 1917. Lieutenant Henry Beauchamp defies his captain's orders by rescuing an injured private on the battlefield. He comforts the young man in his last moments. This spurs Henry to write an open letter to anyone who will read it. He poses the age-old question, what's the point? This war is long and hope is dwindling. Why does any of this matter? What is there to live for? As Henry writes his letter, we see a montage of him fighting alongside his troop. Henry's quite an eloquent writer. After this, we cut to the War Office, Post and Telegraph Censorship Department in London, 1917. Julia stumbles upon Henry's letter. It moves her, and she replies to him. What transpires next is a back and forth between these newly christened pen pals. It's abundantly clear they're falling for each other. Julia gives Henry hope, which he sorely needs to get through the war. Julia tells him about her love for Scotland. Henry admits he's never been, but hopes to visit the Highlands with her someday. In one letter, Henry states his plan of asking for leave the following month. He won't have time for a trip to Scotland. However, he can finally meet Julia in person in London. As Julia reads this, planes invade the airspace above the city, dropping bombs throughout. One explosion sends debris flying through Julia's window. She ducks under her table for shelter. 2 weeks pass, and Julia hasn't heard from Henry. She's nervous. What if he died on the battlefield? When she leaves work, though, Henry is waiting for her on the steps. They embrace. Then, they have sex in Julia's apartment. Conversation turns to the subject of marriage, which Julia isn't opposed to. Sure enough, the next scene sees our lovebirds as the Beauchamps, having tied the knot. After this, Julia comforts Henry as he copes with his PTSD from his time in the war. Julia is Henry's beacon, his glimmer of hope, now and always. Later, we return to the end of the premiere episode. Julia has traveled through the stones. She wakes up in the 18th century. Julia notices the gem in her wedding ring is missing. Craigna-Dun always requires jewels for travel. Julia calls out for Henry, assuming she's still in her present time. Then, she writes on a rock with an arrow, hoping he will see the message and find her. Next, Julia flags down a couple who ride down the road in a wagon. They only speak Gaelic. They refer to her as Sassenach, like mother, like daughter. Julia asks if they've seen Henry, describing his physical appearance. She mentions Inverness, which they call Invernice in Scottish Gaelic. The couple motions for her to join them in the wagon, seemingly implying that they can take her to Inverness. Suddenly, a third person with them puts a sack over Julia's head and knocks her unconscious. They place her in the wagon and take her to, presumably, Castle Leathers. Meanwhile, Henry goes through the stones. He calls out for Julia. Then, he discovers her message on the rock and follows the arrow. Later, Julia wakes up in a dimly lit room with Davina. As it turns out, the couple who brought Julia to Castle Leathers, the Connors, used her to pay off their debts to Lord Lovat. Julia meets Lord Lovat while Brian watches from afar. Lovat is super gross with Julia. He orders Davina to dress Julia in something more appropriate for being a maidservant. Julia begs to know where Henry is and urges Lovat to release her. She doesn't belong here. After this interaction, Brian proposes that Lovat accept money from the Connors too. Clan Fraser desperately needs the money. The castle could use repairs. Lovat brushes off his son's suggestion. Meanwhile, Henry asks a couple of Scotsmen, who also clock him as a Sassenach, if they have seen Julia. He wanders into a nearby pub and asks the bartender the same question. Everyone therein practically laughs him out of the establishment. Temporarily resigned, Henry asks for a pint of ale. Malcolm pays for it. Henry thanks him. He notices Malcolm and Clan Grant's bladier discussing property deed matters. As he walks by, Henry whispers his opinion to Malcolm. Archbug and the Bladier almost drop Henry down a well before Malcolm asks him to elaborate. Henry whispers something else in Malcolm's ear. It's enough to persuade Malcolm to bring Henry to Beaumont House, Clan Grant's seat, to meet his father. Elsewhere, Davina trains Julia in the art of being a maid. Julia insists she's not supposed to be here. She must find her husband. She's not property. Julia lost Henry, but he's not dead. Time travel and all that. Julia pivots, asking Davina about the day and the year. She realizes she's in 1714 Scotland. Davina advises Julia not to linger in Lovat's presence, which is essentially what we heard in episode 1. At the same time, Henry and Malcolm arrive at Beaumont House. He meets Isaac, Laird of Clan Grant. Malcolm urges Henry to tell his father what he knows about the property deed discussion at the pub with the Campbells. Henry applies his experience as a solicitor to the situation. He also informs Isaac that his Bladier was misrepresenting him. In fact, check his pockets. You will find a bag of coins therein. So, Isaac sends Arch to beat the snot out of said Bladier. Arch returns with a bag of coins. Isaac wants to hire Henry as his new Bladier. Initially, Henry declines the offer, citing that he has more pressing matters. He's looking for someone. Isaac insists that Henry will have access to everything Clan Grant has to offer. They'll also travel across clan lands, covering a lot of ground. Henry accepts the job offer. Later, Julia performs her maid duties at Castle Leathers. While in Lovat's office, she finds a map of the countryside leading to Inverness. She conceals it after grabbing blank parchment and hiding it in her dress. Lovat observes her from the hallway. He asks her what she's doing in there. Julia asserts she was merely dusting. Now she must help Davina with the mending. That evening, Julia attempts to escape. We see her running away from the castle. However, Brian catches up to her on horseback. He urges her to turn back, citing that a storm is coming, and you don't want to be caught in a storm in the Highlands. Suddenly, Lovat's muscle, Balak, catches Julia and brings her back to the castle. Julia insists she doesn't belong here. Lovat reveals that the punishment for trying to run away is 20 lashings. Brian takes the fall for Julia, claiming he persuaded her to leave. It was his idea. So, Lovat orders Balak to administer the 20 lashings on Brian instead. His own son. Davina escorts Julia back to her quarters. Elsewhere, Arch leads Henry to the Bladier's quarters at Beaumont House. He sees what happened to the last Bladier. The man's head is on a spike. 1 month later, Henry meets with Ned in the Grant carriage. This is following Dougal's attack on the Grants. Henry informs Ned that Isaac is pissed. He wants Dougal's head. However, Ned has a proposal to assuage the tension between the clans. What if they offer Ellen as a bride for Malcolm? A betrothal might work wonders. Henry hesitates. Ned mentions that he heard that Henry was asking for a woman at the gathering. Henry claims he has very particular tastes regarding women. Ned offers to help Henry satisfy his carnal cravings if the latter brings the marriage proposal to Isaac. Henry agrees to this. That evening, Julia writes Henry a letter in her quarters. Henry also pens a letter for his wife. He vows never to stop looking for her. Both admit how much they miss the other and baby Claire. Julia hopes Henry is with Claire in the present. A montage plays out as Julia and Henry go about their new duties in this strange world, two people out of time. They each seal their respective letters with a kiss. They will find each other no matter what. Third episode begins with Ellen Mackenzie having a dream about her getting hot and heavy with Brian Fraser. Mrs. Fitz rouses her from her slumber. Fitz prays aloud that the continued gathering of the clan will produce a new laird, preferably Colum or Dougal. Then, Fitz asks Ellen if she's happy because she's smitten with her new suitor. Fitz voices her approval. Ellen assumes she's referring to Brian. However, Fitz elaborates, revealing her betrothal to Malcolm Grant. Ellen storms into Colum's office, demanding to know why he's arranging a marriage for her. She insists she's more helpful to the clan at Castle Leoch. After all, she provided their late father with counsel. Colum claims Red Jacob was merely humoring her. This union between clans will undoubtedly mitigate the damage inflicted by Dougal. Meanwhile, Murtaugh is in a sour mood because Ellen is engaged. Brian is shocked. Not to mention, Murtaugh and Brian are both in love with Ellen. At the same time, Davina clocks that Julia is pregnant. Davina gives Julia Savin to induce an abortion. Julia knows the dangers of this herb, though. She pivots, proposing that Davina let her go. She's no use to anyone while with child. Davina reminds Julia that her husband vanished. Where could she go? A maid without a penny to her name. Julia points out that Brian calls Davina Ma. Davina admits she's Brian's mother. However, he's the laird's son. Davina pushes the Savin before Julia. This is her choice. Later, Ellen chats with Dougal about Colm surreptitiously arranging her engagement to Malcolm. Dougal states that Colm had no right to do that, as he's not the laird. Colm simply made the Grant's injury a problem, so he could provide a solution. Ellen asks her brother if he would rescind Colm's offer should he become laird. Dougal admits he doesn't see the benefit of aligning themselves with the Grants. They're more of a threat than an ally. Ellen wonders if the men supporting James McKinney for laird are a concern for Dougal. Dougal believes he has enough followers to win the title. That evening, Dougal discusses the Jacobite cause with Marcus McRannoch. Red Jacob contributed significantly to said cause. Dougal vows that, should he become laird, he will find a more suitable match than Malcolm Grant for Ellen. McRannoch vows to ensure that any clansman who supports a Stuart king will throw his support behind Dougal. Fitz and Ellen chat about the latter's impending union. Ellen feels like a piece on a chessboard getting shuffled around. However, she still has a few moves up her sleeve. Fitz remarks that she speaks like a true Mackenzie. After this, Ellen, Jocasta, and Janet watch from afar as McKinney tries to persuade a group of wives to get their husbands to support his bid for laird. Jocasta informs Ellen about Dougal offering her to McRannoch. Later, Brian and Murtaugh return to Castle Leathers. The men inform Julia and Davina of their plans to relay what they gleaned at the gathering to Lovat. Davina offers to send Julia up with food for the meeting. Brian decides to spare Julia the task by doing it himself. Then, Lord Lovat learns about Clan Mackenzie's move to arrange the Ellen and Malcolm marriage. Lovat interprets this act as a means of turning Clan Grant against him. Now, he will have two enemies, operating as one in strength. Lovat remarks that engagements can be broken. He wonders if there's a reason Ellen has remained unmarried for so long. A stain on her reputation, perhaps? Lovat decides to write to Isaac Grant himself. After Lovat leaves the room, Murtaugh rejoices. If Malcolm refuses Ellen, he might have a chance of winning her hand. Elsewhere, Ned and Ellen chat about her unwanted betrothal. Ned learns about Dougal offering Ellen to McRannoch to strengthen his alliance with the Jacobites. He reveals that Colm and Dougal have sown seeds of division in the clan, making a clearer path for McKinney's victory. Then we flash back to Colm and Dougal going on a cattle raid. Jacob insists that this will determine who's more suited to be his successor. Later, Dougal escorts Colm back into the castle. Colm cries out in pain. We learn that Colm's spooked horse threw him off. His leg is most likely broken. They never made it to their destination, so Dougal and Colm abandoned the raid. Next, Ellen gifts Colm with a pet bird. Jacob barges into Colm's room, insisting he should be on his feet by now. Colm explains that the doctor claims he should be well by Hogmanay. His leg is still healing. Then, Colm explains how he intended to heed Jacob's advice, but the raid went awry. Jacob believes Colm failed. The men didn't follow him, and they certainly won't follow him as clan chief. He storms out. Colm limps after his father, claiming he's still worthy of consideration as the latter's heir. Suddenly, Colm trips. Jacob orders Ellen to help Colm back to his bed. In the present, Ellen pulls Colm aside. She admits his callousness from earlier wounded her. However, she understands why Colm needs the Grants to side with them over McKinney. She suggests that Colm invite Malcolm to the oath-taking. Colm claims he doesn't need her counsel. Ellen presses him not to waver in this fight. Not everything can be solved with a sword. Sometimes, a pen is the necessary weapon. In another flashback, we see Jacob scold Dougal for his role in Colm's injury at the cattle raid. His punishment? Lots of lashings. Ellen watches as Jacob removes his shirt. Jacob won't cease the lashes until Dougal bleeds. Dougal braces himself. Eventually, Jacob stops, even though Dougal's back isn't bleeding. Jacob declares he couldn't beat more sense into Dougal if he tried. After this, Ellen confronts Dougal in the present for putting his needs before the clan. Dougal and Colum have been so busy trying to best each other in the race to be laird that McKinney will surpass them both to claim the prize. Is that what they want, McKinney at the helm? He doesn't have their best interests at heart. Later, Ned meets Ellen in her room. She reveals she's found a loophole, a way to resolve the McKinney situation. Ellen gives Ned a piece of paper with her idea. Ned reads it before offering a look of surprise. It's the day of the oath-taking. Malcolm Grant approaches Ellen to note that he's glad she's feeling better. Ellen plays along, stating she believes their match is as favorable can be. As Ellen heads upstairs to be with her sisters, we see Henry is hot on Malcolm's heels. Then, Colum makes his case for being clan chief. He pledges himself to the clan and admits he might not be physically capable as a warrior, but he will use his wit to protect the clan's interests. That said, should the day come that they will need to go to war, Colum will defer to Dougal as war chieftain. Dougal delivers a speech of his own, vowing to lead the clan to victory in times of battle. Next, Dougal kneels before Colum and swears fealty to the latter. McKinney storms out, it's over for him. Colum reciprocates, kneeling before Dougal to swear fealty to him in times of war. Jocasta asks Ellen if this was her doing. Colum and Dougal are a united front now. Ned explains the legality of it to the attendees. It is possible for Colum and Dougal to share leadership through separate duties. What transpires next is everyone therein pledging their loyalty to Mackenzie brothers, including McKinney. Colum informs McKinney that they intend to keep the latter as their most trusted counsel. That evening, Ned and Henry meet in a brothel. Archbug stands watch. Ned reassures Henry that the Mackenzies will keep their word regarding the betrothal. Before they part ways, Ned brings the brothel madam, Una Hay, over to chat with Henry about the woman he's looking for. Henry describes Julia's appearance. Of course, Ned and Una assume Henry merely has a particular taste in women, not that he's searching for his wife. Una promises to keep her eye out. After this, Julia writes a letter to Henry. She keeps to her duties around the castle. However, Julia's losing hope of ever leaving this prison and reuniting with Henry. She longs for home for Claire. Julia wants Claire to meet her younger sibling someday. Then, Julia apologizes in her letter for what she's about to do, but this will save her and protect their child. Julia walks into Lovat's chambers and disrobes. Lovat removes the covers on his bed and urges her to warm. Fourth episode begins with Julia spilling the morning milk. She tells Davina that there's no use crying over spilled milk, but Davina's worried about the fairy folk. She fears Julia has angered them. To top it all off, Lord Lovat is returning home from his month-long visit to Edinburgh. Then we flash back, or forward, to around the time Julia was pregnant with Claire. She's in her apartment. She picks up her copy of Peter Pan and Wendy before asking Henry how he feels about the name Peter if they have a boy. Then, Henry reveals he's going to chat with his former boss about getting his job back at the solicitor's firm. Before he departs, Julia feels a kick. She places Henry's hand on her stomach. Julia asks Henry if he will be disappointed if they have a girl instead. Henry reassures her that he will love their child regardless. In 1713, Lovat returns to Castle Leathers from Edinburgh. Julia sits on her bed with what looks like poisoned sumac. She rubs it all over her chest, neck, and arms. Later, Una Hay informs Henry at the brothel that she's found Julia. However, we see it's not Julia, but a brunette woman, Seema, who works there. Seema reveals Una has instructed her to do whatever Henry wants. Henry urges her to put her clothes back on. He sits on her bed and admits he was worried he would discover Julia here. Seema has a more half-glass-full approach. At least she's here in the brothel and not out in the cold. Meanwhile, Brian gives Lovat a letter from the Grants. Well, Henry wrote it as their representative. Lovat reads part of it aloud to Brian, the part that addresses Lovat's concern regarding Ellen's image. Henry writes that Clan Mackenzie's interests do not align with Clan Grant's. They would need sufficient evidence to prove Ellen is unworthy of Malcolm's hand. Lovat doesn't buy it, though. He believes there's a reason she's been unwed for so long. Julia emerges with Lovat's lamb stew. He notices a rash on her neck and chest. Julia admits she gets it all over her body on occasion. Lovat's just grateful it isn't contagious. Julia reveals there's a simple remedy, but she would need to visit the apothecary. Lovat urges Belloch to escort Julia to Beaulieu. Brian quickly volunteers to accompany her instead. Next, at Castle Leoch, Colum tells Ellen that Malcolm has requested she attend a Beltaine celebration near Inverness in 2 months. The catch? She must go with him as his betrothed. Ellen puts her foot down. She insists they no longer need the Grants on their side, since they served their purpose, to help Colum secure the lairdship. Colum refuses to renege on his word, though. Ellen pivots, asserting that if she marries Malcolm, she will be devoted to Clan Grant, body and soul. She can't aid her former family. Ellen runs into Dougal in the corridor, who insists he would rather she marry Marcus McGrannoch. Dougal realizes Ellen is trying to drive a wedge between him and Colum. He declares that they're a united front now. Later, Isaac Grant chats with Henry about his search for Julia. Isaac hopes Henry can perform his duties sufficiently for Clan Grant, and that this search won't take precedence. Quarter day is fast approaching, and Henry must collect rent money from Isaac's tenants. Isaac tells Henry he must ask for a small increase in their usual pay. Archbug will accompany him. Elsewhere, Brian and Julia are en route to the apothecary. Brian asks Julia about her condition. How often does she get it? What causes it? Is it really all over her body? Julia puts the kibosh on this line of questioning. After this, we see Henry address the tenants who live on Grant land as they prepare to pay rent. He informs the first tenant about the rent increase. He reluctantly drops an extra shilling. Then, a woman whose husband passed away claims she doesn't have enough to pay rent. She has 4 children to feed, along with another on the way. However, she offers Henry some fresh honey, hoping this will appease Isaac. Henry accepts it, but informs her she must eventually pay what she owes. This angers the man before her. Another man asks about the former Bladier. Henry informs him that said Bladier is no longer in the service of Clan Grant. Suddenly, the man punches Henry. Henry fights back. He beats the snot out of the man. Eventually, the fighting ceases. Henry snaps out of it, realizing how much damage he inflicted on the tenant. Why didn't Arch stop him? Arch believed Henry was shaking the money out of the man. Arch reminds Henry that he must get Isaac every shilling he's owed, regardless of the sob stories these people tell him. We flash back to Henry's time in the war. He sits with a private. The young soldier claims he's so nervous he needs a cigarette. Henry tries to dissuade him from smoking, asserting they will hear them. As an explosion rings out, Julia turns on the light. Henry is in at the foot of their bed screaming. He was having a PTSD-fueled nightmare. Julia embraces Henry and sings softly to him to assuage his anxiety. Julia gives him her necklace before praying St. Anthony will protect him. In the present, or the past, Arch wakes up Henry, asking him what's wrong with him. Henry has been screaming bloody murder and muttering about Julia in his sleep. Henry urges Arch not to worry about it. Elsewhere, Julia asks Brian why he hasn't left Castle Leathers. He's a good-looking lad. Brian admits his being a bastard doesn't exactly entice the lassies. She recites a quote she read once that stuck with her. Brian asks Julia if she can read, to which she responds, a little. In the 20th century, Henry reads the newspaper about the National Lottery returning to raise funds during the war. Julia admits she would pay for a ticket. Henry is unsure whether the money will go to those who need it, probably to purchase more munitions to keep the fighting going in perpetuity. Julia grabs his hand, telling him that people need something to believe in. Hope keeps us going. So, Henry tells the Grant tenants that they can pay what they can for their rent. To supplement, he's creating a lottery. The tenants can purchase as many tickets as they want to enter the lottery with the additional money contributed to their rent. Henry will place the tickets in Arch's hat. He'll draw the winner. The winner won't have to pay rent for a year living for free on Clan Grant lands. Arch vehemently protests this. Isaac won't be happy. Henry fires back that those who can afford to pay extra will balance it out. They'll have the funds. Elsewhere, Brian and Julia wind up near Castle Leoch. Brian remarks that Julia's ailment seems to have healed on its own. He knows she feigned her condition. He asks Julia to help him out by sneaking into Leoch to deliver a message to Ellen. Brian wants to see his beloved. So, Julia and Brian strike a deal. If Julia does this, Brian will help her escape Leathers. She must reunite with her beloved. Julia marches into Leoch via the servants' entrance. Julia meets Mrs. Fitz, who earlier Brian explains is Murtaugh's aunt and Ellen's maid. She concocts an excuse for being there, stating that the housekeeper at Leathers fell ill. Julia knows plants well, so she left to find some. However, she lost her way. Mrs. Fitz allows Julia to stay for a bit to recover her strength. Despite working for warring clans, Mrs. Fitz believes the servants must stick together. Then, Mrs. Fitz informs Julia that Ellen has been heartsick lately and refuses to leave her chambers. She knocks on Ellen's door with food, but Ellen insists she's not hungry. After Mrs. Fitz leaves, Julia knocks on Ellen's door. "I'm the bridge," she says, proving Brian sent her. Claire's mom and Jamie's mom finally meet. Julia tells Ellen that Brian is outside and wants to see her. She shakes her head, claiming she can't go. If Colum or Dougal learn about a Fraser on Mackenzie land, they will hunt him down. The conversation pivots to Beltaine. Julia learns about Ellen attending with Malcolm at the celebration near Inverness. She realizes the Standing Stones, Craigna Dunn, are there. Perhaps she will find Henry there. After this, Julia persuades Ellen to sneak out with her to meet Brian. Julia stands at a distance as Brian and Ellen reunite. Brian asks Ellen if she wants to marry Malcolm. Ellen insists her feelings for Brian haven't changed. Brian declares his love for her. However, someone is lurking nearby, so Brian and Julia had better hightail it out of there. Ellen runs into Dougal, who's patrolling the area. Ellen makes up an excuse for being outside so late. She couldn't sleep and wanted to pray in Mother Nature. The following day, Henry continues on with the lottery, much to Arch's irritation. On the way back to Leathers, Brian tells Julia he's grateful he will get to see Ellen at Beltaine. Julia informs him that Ellen will be there with Malcolm. Brian will need someone to distract Malcolm so he can spend time with Ellen. She volunteers to attend the celebration with him. However, in return for helping Brian, Julia would like Brian's assistance. She reveals that she and Henry were separated near Inverness. She hopes Brian can help her find him. Meanwhile, Ellen presents Colum with a list of guests for her and Malcolm's impending nuptials. She mends fences with Colum, insisting nothing is worth the chasm between them. At the same time, Isaac isn't super pleased that Henry didn't follow his instructions. Henry presents a big old bag full of money, more than what is needed. It includes the increase and is enough to cover rents for the quarter. But Isaac doesn't like the idea of anyone foregoing rent for a whole year. No thanks to Henry's lottery. Henry tells Isaac that he can deduct the lottery winner's rent from his earnings to offset the cost. Isaac allows his defiance this time, but next time he won't be so kind. After Henry leaves, Arch asks Isaac if he wants him to kill their new Bladier. Isaac claims he doesn't, but to watch Henry closely. In the 20th century, Henry apologizes to Julia for his panic attack the night before. He tearfully states that something in him is broken. Julia reassures Henry that he's not broken. She fell in love with the man who wrote her those beautiful letters. During their conversation, Henry has an idea for a girl's name, Claire. It's French for clear and bright. Then, in the 18th century, Henry returns to the brothel for some time with Seema. He tells her that he's been searching for Julia for months now. Seema tries to initiate intimacy, but Henry asks her if they can just lie in bed together for a spell. At Leoch, Lovat ushers Julia into his chambers. He wants only one thing, however, Julia urges him to be careful with her. She's with child, his child, or so he thinks. Lovat is over the moon. Davina pops up and Lovat tells her the good news. Davina congratulates them. Julia must do what she can to protect herself and her baby. Fifth episode begins with Ellen dressing for Beltaine, where she will accompany Malcolm Grant as his betrothed. Jocasta interrupts to compliment her sister's appearance and inform her that they're about to leave. At Castle Leathers, Brian asks Julia if she's ready to depart for Beltaine. The plan is to sneak away without anyone noticing them. Brian tells Julia about Beltaine. Folks gather from all over to celebrate the beginning of summer on neutral ground. Julia asks about the fertility blessing. Brian informs her that it's more geared toward blessing a woman before she has a bairn in the belly. Unfortunately, Brian and Julia don't get far before Davina catches them. Julia reassures Davina that she did as much housework as possible to help Davina while she's gone. Brian lies, claiming he wants to take Julia to the fertility ritual at Beltaine. Davina remarks that Lord Lovat will want to keep Julia close, considering the child is his. Brian's going to have a baby brother. Brian calls out Julia for lying to him. Of course, she can't disclose the truth in front of Davina. He leaves for the celebration without Julia. Meanwhile, Clan Mackenzie is en route to Beltaine. Jocasta strikes up a conversation with the daydreaming Ellen. She observes that Ellen will wear many resplendent gowns and ride in fancy carriages once she weds Malcolm. Of course, Jocasta knows her sister isn't thinking about Malcolm. She reminds Ellen that Beltaine is a celebration where sins burn away in the need fire. Then Murda finds Brian preparing to leave for Beltaine. Murda hopes to catch Ellen there. Sure, she's betrothed to Malcolm Grant, but engagements can be broken. He assumes Brian will be a solid wingman. Later, the Mackenzies arrive at Beltaine. Ned advises Ellen not to do anything rash, to remain on Malcolm's good side. If he decides not to marry her, Colum could easily find someone worse. Then Ellen reunites with Malcolm, while Jocasta tags along. Jocasta chimes in that Ellen wouldn't stop talking about Malcolm on the way there. Ellen returns the favor by telling Malcolm that Jocasta will want to receive fertility blessings at the stones. At the same time, Ned meets with Henry. Henry asks Ned about the stones. Of course, that's how he arrived in this century. Ned explains that maidens dance around the stones at nightfall to appease the fairies and prevent folks from being taken by them. The chat turns to Isaac Grant receiving that letter from Lovat in which he voiced his concern regarding Ellen's reputation. Ned insists there's nothing to worry about. Ellen's reputation is pristine. He adds that Lovat is merely worried about his alliance with the Grants. Lovat blames Red Jacob for Clan Fraser's downfall, for stripping him of his titles. However, Lovat sullied his own reputation by kidnapping and raping a noblewoman. Meanwhile, Ellen participates in a dance competition that will determine the May Queen of Beltaine. Malcolm reveals that being a solid dancer is only part of the criteria for winning that May Queen crown. Brian surreptitiously joins the dance, much to Ellen's delight. She insists they must pretend not to know each other, though. Murda observes them dancing, hoping Brian's putting in a good word for him. They decide to meet later at the abandoned castle tower. Jocasta sidles up beside Murtaugh. Murtaugh urges her to dance with him despite not being a maiden. After the dancing, Ellen is unsurprisingly crowned the May Queen. Now, she must select a king. Malcolm, Murtaugh, and Brian are among those who throw their hats in the ring. Ellen chooses Malcolm to avoid suspicion. At Leather's Misery, Lovat's seer is there to offer divinations on Beltaine. This is when the veil between worlds is the thinnest. Misery tells Lovat that she sees men ensnared in a field of thorns. However, he's not among them. He stands victorious, reveling in his inevitable return to power. Lovat asks about his unborn child. Maestri asks Julia to hold an egg against her very pregnant stomach. Then she breaks that egg into a bowl. Lovat remarks that there are 2 yolks in the bowl. Could he have twins? Maestri gazes at the yolks, observing that, yes, there are 2 children, 1 lass, 1 lad. But the lass comes later. Elsewhere, Ellen and Jocasta strike a deal. Ellen will sneak off to do her own thing, and Jocasta can do the same. They will vouch for each other and swear they both received the fertility blessings. Next, Brian and Ellen have their clandestine meeting near the castle tower. They have at least until sunset when the ceremony takes place. They finally have their first kiss. Murtaugh watches them smooch from afar. Ellen and Brian head inside the castle tower, where they continue kissing. Brian's afraid to go too far. He doesn't want to ruin her virtue. "Ruin me," Ellen whispers before they take it further. Brian rips off a piece of his tartan and wraps it around their clasped hands as they recite vows. Blood of my blood and bone of my bone. They finally make up. Afterward, Ellen and Brian lay entwined in postcoital bliss. Brian tells Ellen about his eat, pray, love journey the year before when he left Scotland. He warns her that his father is worse than what folks say. Brian reveals he now has a reason to stay in the country. Ellen insists she would choose him again and again. Later, Archbug runs into an inebriated Murtaugh. Arch recognizes Murtaugh as the first to join Malcolm Grant as a potential May King to Ellen's May Queen. Is he trying to encroach on Malcolm's territory? Murtaugh taunts Arch before the latter administers a few hefty punches to the gut. Blood spews out of Murtaugh's mouth. Elsewhere, Davina chats with Lovett about Maisry's divinations. She states that Julia was pregnant before she arrived at Leathers. Davina asserts that Julia's not carrying Lovat's child. Lovat bulldozes over this, urging Davina to relieve Julia of her duties and ensure the birthing process goes off without a hitch. Then, Ned tells Henry about meeting the love of his life in Edinburgh. They tragically parted ways, unfortunately. Ned had to choose between dwelling in his sorrow or starting anew. Red Jacob offered him that opportunity for a fresh start after he robbed Ned of his valuables. Ned believes Henry's search for Julia will consume him whole. Perhaps it's time to move on. Meanwhile, Julia pulls out her wedding ring, which is missing a gem. She slips it onto her finger. Before the Needfire ceremony, Malcolm gives Ellen a gift. At the same time, Jocasta sees a swaying and bloody Murtaugh standing alone in one of the tents. She urges him to sit down. Then, Jocasta takes a cloth to Murtaugh's bloody lip. They kiss. It's all going well until Murtaugh calls out Ellen's name. Jocasta pulls away instantly and storms out in tears. Next, Julia writes a letter to Henry as the Needfire ceremony commences. People dance in animal masks as the fire rages. Henry watches the maidens dance around the stones. Eventually, Ellen and Malcolm walk down the aisle toward the fiery display in their Beltaine attire. Brian watches from the sidelines. Murtaugh glares at his cousin as Jocasta gazes mournfully at Murtaugh. Henry lies on his cot, tears in his eyes. He clutches his necklace from Julia. Julia also lies on her bed. She kisses her wedding ring. At the ceremony, Malcolm kisses Ellen on the lips. Julia's voiceover to Henry wonders whether their split was out of their control. Perhaps they're victims of space and time. Malcolm grabs Ellen's hand and raises it in triumph as the crowd cheers. Sure, they look like they're dressed for their wedding. However, Ellen and Brian's vows in the castle tower hold true for them. Sixth episode begins with Julia waking in her soaked bed. Her water has broken. Julia ventures outside to chat with Brian. He senses that the baby is on the way. He immediately orders the others to send for the howdy, a midwife. Julia explains that her child's father is Henry, not Lord Lovat. She only laid with Lovat to curb his unwanted advances and to protect herself and her baby. She reassures him that he's not getting a little brother. Brian seems to believe her this time. He warns her about what's to come. Confinement won't be easy. However, this ain't Julia's first rodeo. Meanwhile, Henry attempts to sneak away to look for midwives in the area. Arch catches him. He reveals that he and the Laird are tired of Henry's incessant searching for some mystery woman. Henry finally shares that he's on the hunt for his wife. She's pregnant and due to give birth very soon. Arch's face changes. He discloses that he and his wife Merdina lost a child. Merdina was lucky to survive. Arch vows to chat with Isaac Grant about arranging interviews with midwives to determine if anyone has met Julia. Elsewhere, Davina stokes Lovat's fire and empties the chamber pot, preparing his quarters for the day. She recalls the first time he raped her years ago. Lovat threatened to sack her if she didn't comply. He pulled her on top of him and forced himself into her. In the present, Lovat mutters, "Julia," to himself before turning to see it's Davina. Davina informs him that Julia is about to give birth. Initially, he doesn't believe her. When it dawns on him that this is actually happening, Lovat reveals his plans to take Julia to the Kirk. He doesn't want his son, a future Scottish king, to be born out of wedlock. The boy must be legitimized. Davina insists that Julia is too far along to make the trek to the Kirk. Julia enters the main hall, where her confinement will take place. She sits on a makeshift bed. On the upper level, Brian and Davina have a chat. Brian hopes everyone will treat Julia kindly. She's a Sassenach, after all, with different customs than them. Davina asks Brian if he and Julia are a thing. Brian's had a glint in his eye of late. Brian insists they're nothing more than friends. Brian asks his mother if she ever wanted to marry Lovat. Davina mentions how Lovat treated her mistress, Lady Amelia, the noblewoman he stands accused of kidnapping and raping. Brian asks Davina if she loved Lovat at one point. Davina evades answering that one. Brian wants to be worthy of the Fraser name. He wants to stand tall, like a giant among men. His mom reassures him that he is worthy of carrying the family moniker. She wonders what's gotten into him. He's never cared about titles or coin before. Regardless, she advises him to find a lass who's truly deserving of him. Later, Henry questions a series of midwives. None of them help deliver an Englishwoman's baby. Arch observes the interactions from afar. Henry looks slightly discouraged, but soldiers on. At the same time, the Howdy and the gossipers arrive at Castle Leathers. One of them places a cake on the table. Then, the women surround Julia. They claim they're there to help Julia through the confinement and birth of her bairn. Of course, mentions of the prophecy take center stage. Sure, Julia and the Laird aren't married. However, who wouldn't want to usher the future King of Scotland into the world? Davina tells the group that a bastard is a bastard. She accuses Julia of seducing Lovat for her own gains and of doing the same with her son. She's a temptress. The Howdy and the gossipers instantly turn on Julia. Their tune shifts from one of ardent support to immense judgment. According to them, Julia must repent of her sins, regardless of whether she's carrying a king. The women hurl vitriol and scream at her. Davina asks Julia about the father of her child. Who is he? Julia doubles down, asserting that Lord Lovat is her baby's dad. Elsewhere, Brian and Lovat drink to the next Fraser. Brian gets vulnerable with his father. He wonders what he has to do to be deserving of the Fraser name in his dad's eyes. How does he please Lovat? Brian insists he does plenty around the household. Lovat rattles off qualities that make a man. Per his assessment, Brian doesn't fit the bill. However, he is a handsome lad. At the same time, the women kick Julia out of her bed. They encircle her like vultures, ready to pick a carcass clean. Once more, they order her to repent. Julia pleads with Davina, appealing to her sensibilities. Julia reminds the group that she's carrying the Laird's child. She could bring him in to corroborate her statements. Julia reassures Davina that she's not trying to steal anything from the latter. She says that Brian is shaped by the love Davina pours into him. She apologizes for Lovat ruining Davina's life. We get another flashback to when Davina was pregnant with Brian. Lovat forced himself into her while she was working. In the present, Henry questions a midwife who knows Julia Beauchamp. Nice lassie, she was, the woman states. The woman claims that a crofter and his wife took Julia in after they discovered her wandering the moors some miles west of here. Apparently, Julia and the baby died during childbirth. Henry looks utterly devastated. He's incredulous at first. Next, Henry demands to know where Julia and his child are. Arch urges Henry to drink away the pain before getting back to work. Outside, Arch pays the midwife. As it turns out, he and the Laird orchestrated all this. The woman lied about Julia and the baby's deaths to put an end to Henry's search. Later, the women surround Julia again, pulling her to the ground. They attempt to cleanse her of a demonic spirit. Julia calls out for Lovat. Davina asks again if Lovat truly is the father. She urges Julia to swear it on her baby's life. Julia fires back that she will never do that. She will do anything to protect her child. Davina's face softens. She understands now. In another flashback, we see Davina in her own confinement. The Howdy and gossipers accused her of seducing Lovat. They also tried to harm Davina's baby. Realizing she endured the same experience as Julia, Davina orders the Howdy and gossipers to leave. Outside, Lovat and Brian meet the Reverend, who will wed the Laird and Julia right in Castle Leathers. Lovat watches as the Howdy and gossipers depart. He urges them to spread the good news that Lovat and Julia tied the knot before welcoming their child. Lovat makes a beeline for the main hall upon learning that Davina has locked herself in there with Julia. Lovat bangs on the door, demanding that Davina open it. Davina orders him to leave. Even the Reverend remarks that Julia is in no shape to recite any vows. After Davina stands up to Lovat, the latter slaps her across the face. Brian lunges at his father, screaming at him to stay away from his mother. Brian also stands up to Lovat and gives him the boot, reminding him that men aren't allowed in the confinement space. Lovat orders Beltaine to grab the strap. He declares that Brian will pay for what he surely deems as insolence. Once the men leave, Davina coaches Julia through the childbirth process. We flash back to Claire's birth in 1918. Henry arrives just in time as a midwife helps Julia give birth in their flat. Henry puts on music to alleviate Julia's pain. She finally gives birth to Claire. Julia and Henry hold their newborn daughter together, marveling at her. In the present or past, Julia pushes out a baby boy. Davina smacks his back to get him to cry. When he does, she places him in Julia's arms. Julia grins from ear to ear. We return to Davina's confinement after birthing Brian. She holds him in her arms and smiles. Meanwhile, Henry runs into the woods, far away from the Grant house. He hyperventilates, but then he recalls Julia's advice. Henry holds his head high and continues running, tears streaking his cheeks. The scene transitions to the end of World War I. Henry runs through the streets of London, enthusiastically proclaiming that the war is over. He barrels into his flat with Julia. Here we see a glitch of sorts. At one point, Henry's getup changes from 20th century clothing to 18th century garb. He's really with Seema in the brothel, pretending she's Julia. Next, he embraces her, claiming he never would have made it through without her. Initially, Seema is bewildered, but she plays along. Then we see a splicing of two scenes, Henry and Julia having sex in 1919, and Henry and Seema having sex in 1714. Afterward, Henry tells Seema, or Julia, that all he needs is her and Claire. Elsewhere, Beltaine whips Brian as Lovat watches. After this, he reunites with Julia, who's relishing the time with her newborn. Brian says that Julia's child might not be his brother, but he vows to be a friend to him. Julia wishes Henry were here. Brian reassures Julia and her baby that they will find Henry one day. Julia remarks that she gets her strength from her children. Brian admits he doesn't have a gift for the bairn. Julia asks Brian about his birthday. Brian doesn't know when he was born. Davina probably does. Julia shares that, where she's from, it's customary to light a candle on a cake and blow it out on your birthday. You must make a wish first, though. Julia grabs the cake that the Howdy and gossipers brought. She lights the candle and presents it to Brian, insisting he must do the honors. Brian makes a wish and blows it out. Seventh episode begins with Henry, Malcolm, and Arch learning that someone raided Clan Grant's cattle. Initially, Arch accuses Clan Mackenzie, but Henry asserts that Ned wouldn't allow such a thing to happen. Arch also offers to inform the laird. Malcolm stops him, insisting he not disturb the laird. Isaac Grant hasn't been feeling well of late. Later, Ellen and Mrs. Fitz are preparing the wedding sheets for the former's impending nuptials. Mrs. Fitz explains they will have to embroider it with flowers before snipping a wee hole for the couple's privates. Colum enters Ellen's quarters, asking for updates regarding Ellen's trousseau. Ellen reveals they still have to embroider the wedding sheets. Plus, there's the childbed gown and linens to contend with. Colum claims Ellen can use their mother's. Ellen reminds her brother that their late mom was married in haste. She didn't have a trousseau. This will make them look cheap to the Grants. Colum concedes, allowing Ellen and Mrs. Fitz until the Sabbath to finish up. He plans to write to the Grants to solidify the wedding date. At the same time, Brian offers to christen Julia's son the traditional Highland way. We see they're outside the kirk, where Lovat plans to have the Protestant minister christen the child. Davina heads outside to fetch Julia and Brian. Julia tries to feed William, but he won't latch. Davina reassures Julia that William won't starve. Julia fears that Lovat will ambush her with a wedding since they're at the kirk. While they talk, William finally latches. Then, the minister conducts the christening. It's a small crowd in attendance, much to Lovat's ire. Don't they know they're in the presence of a future king of Scotland? Brian notices Murtaugh slip in during the proceedings. Next, Ned informs Colum and Ellen that the Grants suspect that Dougal stole their cattle. Ned shares that Dougal was driving their keen to market at Crieff. However, he traveled onward to a cattle auction at the House of Nairn. Ellen interjects, revealing that the House of Nairn doesn't have cows. Lord and Lady Nairn are Jacobites. Ellen knows this because she keeps correspondence with Lady Nairn, Margaret. Ellen offers to fetch Dougal under the guise of inviting the Nairns to her wedding. She will dissuade him from attending future Jacobite meetings. Ned declares he will meet with the Grants' Bladier to reassure them that the Mackenzies didn't steal their keen. During the christening, Lovett announces that his child is his namesake. After the christening, Brian notices Murtaugh filing out with the other attendees. He tells his father that he must speak with Murtaugh. Outside, Brian approaches Murtaugh, who punches him. He claims it's because of Ellen. Brian apologizes profusely, insisting he didn't know who she was until it was too late. Murtaugh reveals it hurts more that Brian withheld this information from him, not that Brian and Ellen fell in love. Balak observes this confrontation from the kirk entrance. Next, the minister begins to fill out the birth and marriage register. Lovat stops him, insisting they can do this at Castle Leathers when they're better prepared. Lovat orders Davina to plan for the minister's visit the following day for luncheon. Brian and Murtaugh chat with Lovat. Lovat asks Murtaugh for an update regarding the Jacobites. Murtaugh plans to attend the meeting at the House of Nairn with an open mind. He can assess where Clan Fraser's loyalties should lie regarding the Jacobites. Lovat orders Murtaugh to take Brian with him. He tells Brian and Murtaugh that they must know for what and for whom they're fighting, should the day come. Lovat tells Balak that the boys will settle their dispute on the road. At least Brian won't be there for the wedding the following day. Lovat plans to pay the minister in enough coin so he will do whatever the laird wants. He asks Balak to ensure the minister brings the register to Castle Leathers. Meanwhile, Henry and Ned meet in the pub for a chat. Ned reassures Henry that the Mackenzies aren't behind the reiving. Henry states that within minutes of being here, he learned of the real perpetrator, Rob Roy McGregor, a known Jacobite. Ned reveals that the Mackenzies are loyal to the crown. Henry persuaded Isaac to remain a loyalist because it's the sensible thing to do. Before Ned leaves, he learns that Henry's search for Julia has come to an end. Ned apologizes. Henry plans to extricate himself from Clan Grant. He knows how to disappear for good. They part ways. Arch enters as Ned departs, revealing they must confront Rob and make him pay for stealing their cows. Henry says he has business to tend to first. Later, Ellen arrives at the House of Nairn. She chats with Margaret for a spell, inviting the latter and her husband to the wedding. However, Margaret knows Ellen is visiting for a different reason. Ellen shares that she has reason to believe her brother is here. Outside, Dougal meets Brian. Murtaugh claims that Brian is a distant cousin. Brian also meets Rob Roy McGregor. Rob notes that he too is an outsider like Brian. Elsewhere, Julia asks Davina for assistance. Lovat wants them to have sex. Julia has monk pepper, aka chasteberry, which she hopes to use to spike Lovat's food. This will render him impotent. Davina is on board. Both women burst into a fit of laughter. Before the Jacobite meeting starts, Ellen finds Dougal. Naturally, he's bewildered to see his sister here. Ellen states that she's there on behalf of Colum to bring him home. Conspiring with the Jacobites won't reflect well on the Mackenzies. Rob addresses the crowd. Ellen spots Brian, the two lock eyes. The group agrees that it's time to rise against the Hanoverian regime and to restore Stuart rule. Dougal offers Mackenzie coin to help finance the inevitable rebellion. We see men bring forth a hefty chest. Ellen calls out Dougal for offering money without Colum's permission. Dougal fires back that Ellen should persuade Malcolm Grant to join the Jacobite cause. He insists it will be the first useful thing she's ever done. Elsewhere, Henry reunites with Seema. Seema pretends they're a couple. Henry breaks things off gently with her, apologizing for his behavior the last time they met. He's been mired in grief. Henry asks if he left his necklace from Julia in Seema's quarters. Seema returns it to him. She begs Henry to take her with him. He gives her a bag of coins, hoping this will alleviate things. He leaves. Seema is in tears. Next, Dougal becomes distracted by a bonny lass at the meeting. He orders Murtaugh to stay with Ellen while he follows said lass into another room. Ellen asks Murtaugh if he's a Jacobite. Murtaugh insists he vowed to reserve his judgment until attending this meeting. Malcolm and Arch arrive. Naturally, Malcolm's shocked to see Ellen there. Ellen explains that she's only there to retrieve Dougal and to dissuade him from falling headfirst into the Jacobite cause. Malcolm believes her. He insists that his father doesn't need to know. However, he did bring some friends. The energy in the room changes swiftly as a bevy of redcoats arrive, courtesy of Malcolm. They arrest Rob. Rob jokes about stealing the Grants' cattle. Malcolm thanks the redcoats for capturing Rob, but wants to handle this internally from here on out. Then, the redcoats decide to arrest all the Jacobites present. Brian surreptitiously fires his gun as a distraction. Of course, this sends everyone in the room scrambling as they attempt to evade the redcoats. Dougal returns and orders his men to grab the chest of coins. Brian tracks down Ellen outside the house. They embrace temporarily. Ellen insists that Isaac wouldn't want her marrying his son if she were at a Jacobite meeting. Unfortunately, Dougal tears Ellen and Brian apart. He punches Brian before a handful of redcoats seize him. Dougal grabs Ellen and yanks her away by the wrist. He can't believe she would fraternize with a Fraser. Dougal threatens to tell Colum about this. Ellen fires back that Colum won't like to hear about his brother offering up the clan's fortune to fund a rebellion. Murdaugh sees someone steal his horse. Brian urges Murdaugh to jump on his horse. However, Murtaugh takes the one beside Dougal instead. The grudge runs deep. Later, Julia arrives at the main hall with William in her arms to find Lovat and the minister there. It's marriage time. Lovat reveals he's found a wet nurse to feed the baby for Julia. Elsewhere, Henry rides a horse toward Craignadown. Unfortunately, Arch and the others working for the Grants track him down. Arch forces Henry to return to work. After this, the minister records a series of dates in the register. He writes that Lovat and Julia were married in November of 1714, with William being born in July of 1715. So, he paid the minister to fudge the dates to make it look like the child was born in wedlock. Then, Davina serves the happy couple their meal. Lovat remarks that his cook used new spices, but the food tastes amazing. Julia and Davina exchange knowing glances. Elsewhere, Mrs. Fitz helps Ellen dress for a ride before nightfall. Ellen heads to the main hall to meet with Colum, who requested her presence. Ellen assumes that Dougal told Colum about Brian. She claims none of what he says is true. Plus, what Dougal did is worse. Colum insists he's not worried about Dougal. However, Henry is here on behalf of the Grants with a request. The letter from Lovat calls Ellen's virtue into question. So, the Grants are requesting a purity test to ascertain if Ellen still has her virtue. Next, Brian reunites with Lovat. Lovat exhibits heretofore unseen concern for his son after Brian mentions almost getting arrested by the redcoats. He explains that Brian is now useful to him. After all, he deflowered Ellen Mackenzie. Now, the Grants will sever their alliance with the Mackenzies and cozy up to the Frasers once again. Brian insists it's not like that. Later, Lovat tries to get it up before having sex with Julia. Of course, he can't, thanks to the monk Pepper. Lovat asks Julia to get more food. Perhaps the spices will help the fox emerge from his den. At the same time, Balak escorts the inebriated minister back to his kirk. Balak kills him. Then he returns the register to the minister's desk in the chapel before retrieving the coin that Lovat had paid the minister. 8th episode begins with Ellen bathing at Castle Leoch, preparing for her impending purity test. Meanwhile, Davy Beaton shows Colum and Dougal some terrifying, medieval-looking implements for performing said purity test. Colum discourages Beaton from using them on his sister. Colum pulls Dougal aside to ask if anything happened to Ellen. Is she no longer a virgin? Dougal claims he doesn't know. So, he never told Colum about catching her with Brian. Colum insists nothing could have happened to Ellen because she never leaves the castle without his permission. Colum reminds Dougal that he sent Ellen there because of his actions. Dougal fires back that Ellen only goes where she wants to. Colum remembers that Ned was watching Ellen during Beltaine. The Laird confronts Ned regarding Beltaine. Ned insists he kept his eye on Ellen for the majority of the time. However, he had to allow her some time alone with Malcolm Grant. Plus, she parted ways with Malcolm temporarily to attend the fertility blessing at the Stones with Jocasta. Jocasta wouldn't let anything happen that could disrupt Ellen's marital prospects. Should Ellen fail the test, the Grants will kill her. Clan Mackenzie will also fall into disarray. After this, Ned approaches Mrs. Fitz. He tries to not so subtly ask her if Ellen has confided in Mrs. Fitz about her virtue. Mrs. Fitz is offended. She barges into Ellen's quarters. Mrs. Fitz insists that Ellen will pass her purity test. She has faith, but Ellen looks anxious. Elsewhere at Castle Leathers, Lovat informs Julia that he's leaving for a few days to bathe in the Wellospa in Aberdeen. He hopes the waters will reinvigorate his manhood and reverse his impotence. Lovat also plans to take as much water back to the castle as possible. Before he departs, Lovat tells Brian that Ellen's undergoing a test to determine if her virtue is intact. Brian asserts that what he and Ellen did was above board. He loves her. Lovat denies this, claiming Brian doesn't actually love Ellen. When he returns, they will celebrate the fall of Clan Mackenzie. He finds it quite poetic that a Fraser deflowered a Mackenzie. Once Lovat is out of sight, Brian storms back into the castle. Davina knows her son is up to something. Brian declares he's heading to Castle Leoch to save his wife. Davina tries to dissuade him from this course of action, citing that the Mackenzies will kill him. At the same time, Mrs. Fitz forces Ellen to drink lots of water. One portion of the test is urinating on command. It must be as clear as water. Ellen finally discloses to Mrs. Fitz that she's not a virgin. Mrs. Fitz assumes it's her nephew, Murtaugh. However, Ellen denies that. In fact, she also refuses to name Brian. Meanwhile, Davina worries about Brian barreling headfirst into trouble. She insists that Ellen Mackenzie will be the death of him. Davina asks Julia to back her up. He can't go to Leoch. Julia acknowledges that Davina is right. However, she has a solution to Ellen's purity test. She mixes ground sugar and eggs. Julia asks Brian if he has gunpowder or saltpeter. Julia creates a concoction to help Ellen pass her test. She tells them that she read about these ingredients working not to restore a woman's hymen, but to give the impression of virginity. Davina didn't know Julia could read. Julia decides to accompany Brian to Leoch. After all, she used a secret tunnel to gain ingress to the castle last time. Initially, Brian vehemently protests this, but he eventually gives in. Next, Julia promises to Davina that she will protect Brian. Davina also vows to protect Julia's son, William. Later, Henry and Malcolm chat while stopping for a rest en route to Leoch. Henry remarks that Isaac requested the purity test, not Malcolm. However, Malcolm's heading to Leoch, not the Laird. Malcolm doesn't like that Ellen must endure this test, but he trusts his betrothed. He has no doubts about her. Henry listens to Malcolm gush about Ellen. If you find a woman you truly love, never let her go. Malcolm offers his condolences regarding Henry's wife. Meanwhile, Brian and Julia ride to Castle Leoch. They stop at a fork in the road. Brian believes they should split up here. He continues to Leoch while she takes the other road to Clan Grant's seat. Then she can reunite with Henry. Julia asserts that there's safety in numbers. She couldn't live with herself if something happened to Brian while she was away, so Julia sticks with him. Later, the Grant crew arrives at Leoch. Malcolm orders Archbug to remain outside and wait for the rest of the party while he and Henry greet the Mackenzies. Arch isn't a fan of being shelved like this. Inside, Colum gathers up enough coin for Ellen's dowry to present to the Grants. Ned looked over the marriage contract to ensure everything is up to snuff. Colum believes they can renegotiate the dowry if Ellen passes the test. Then, Colum, Dougal, and Ned greet Malcolm and Henry. Henry shares that Isaac wanted his own physician and man of the cloth to conduct the purity test. Initially, Colum objects. They weren't apprised of this. However, Ned smooths any ruffled feathers by insisting it's all gravy, whatever makes Isaac more comfortable. At the same time, Julia and Brian sneak into Leoch through the tunnel. Julia urges Brian to stay put while she tracks down Ellen. What if a Mackenzie catches him out in the open? Brian reluctantly remains behind. Meanwhile, Malcolm gets more details regarding the purity test. He doesn't want Ellen to suffer any indignities. He asks Henry to relay to Ellen that he didn't ask for this test. Arbladier vows to pass this on to Ned. Henry ventures out into the corridor. He grabs his necklace from Julia, overcome with emotion. Then he sees Julia walking through the adjacent corridor. However, he assumes she's a ghost. Ned ushers Henry into his office for a chat. Later, Julia knocks on Ellen's door. Mrs. Fitz answers, wondering why a maid from Castle Leathers is here. Ellen recognizes Julia, though. Julia reveals she has a solution to help Ellen pass the test. It's a concoction, but it must be applied and given time to tighten before Ellen takes said test. Ellen urges Mrs. Fitz to get Julia what she needs. Next, Henry informs Ned that he tried to escape the Grants, but they caught him. The only reason he still has his head is that Isaac wants him to bear witness to the purity test. But Henry can't take this anymore. He's attempting to ingratiate himself with Malcolm, appealing to the latter's capacity for love. Malcolm is less cruel and softer than Isaac. Perhaps Malcolm can persuade Isaac to let Henry go. However, if that doesn't work, Henry begs Ned to help him get the hell out of Dodge. Ned vows to lend a hand, offering to meet with Henry at a later date to flesh out a detailed escape plan. After Julia applies the concoction to Ellen's parts, the latter meets with Malcolm outside her room. Malcolm reveals that Henry arranged this for him. He wanted to check in on Ellen. He knows she will prove all those fools wrong. Then, it's the moment of truth. Ellen and Mrs. Fitz head into the great hall, where the menfolk await them. Clan Grant's physician orders her to remove her dressing gown. They start with a urine examination. A virtuous woman's water is clear as crystal, free of color. Initially, Malcolm and Ned attempt to get Ellen out of the pee portion of the test, but our girl just wants to get this over with. So, Ellen chugs a boiled sea holly concoction. Then she waits. A woman should be able to hold her water. After a spell, the physician orders her to relieve herself. The physician and minister examine her urine, finding it to be crystal clear. Next, it's time to examine Ellen's downstairs to see if she's intact. The physician conducts the examination. Virgo intacta, the minister announces to everyone in the great hall. It worked. Colum looks relieved. Ellen and Mrs. Fitz return to Ellen's quarters to inform Julia that her methods were successful. Mrs. Fitz and Ellen thank Julia. Mrs. Fitz is still suspicious as to how Julia snuck into the castle. However, she's still grateful. After this, Julia and Henry finally run into each other in the corridor. Initially, Henry is incredulous. His wife is dead. Is he seeing her ghost again? Julia motions to Henry to follow her downstairs. There, he touches her face. Henry still can't believe it. Hope springs eternal, Julia says, taking his hand. That proves to him that she's real. Henry asks about their child. Julia reveals she named him William after Henry's grandfather. Unfortunately, Brian cuts the reunion short, telling Julia they must leave. After this, he realizes that Julia found Henry. Julia introduces them to each other. Before they part ways, Julia tells Henry she's at Castle Leathers and that they will find each other again. Once Julia and Brian leave, Arch discovers Henry by himself. Henry claims he thought he saw his wife. Outside, Malcolm mistakes Henry's glee regarding Julia for happiness about the outcome of the purity test. Henry plays along, claiming he never doubted Ellen. Malcolm thanks Henry for everything he's done for the clan. At the same time, Mrs. Fitz catches Brian and Julia before they escape through the tunnel. She gives Brian back his tartan from Ellen's belongings. Mrs. Fitz urges Brian to stay away from Ellen. After this, a rider arrives with a letter for Malcolm. Henry opens it and gives it a quick read. He tells Malcolm that Isaac Grant is dead. Ninth episode begins with Lovat informing Brian that the latter will accompany him to the Earl of Mar's Tinchel at Braar. Julia will stay at Castle Leathers to oversee the household. Lovat mentions Isaac Grant's passing and that he pulled one over on Ellen, so the Grants will undoubtedly bend the knee to him. Julia wonders if it might be better for Lovat to bring baby Simon. After all, he's the future king of Scotland. Brian piggybacks off this, insisting that Julia attend as well. All the lairds from the wealthiest clans will have their wives on their arms. It's a power move. Lovat concedes to this, telling Brian and Julia to prepare for departure. Meanwhile, Uncle Malcolm McKinnon Grant makes a pit stop by Malcolm's carriage while en route to Castle Leoch. Uncle Mac was in London, petitioning on behalf of Malcolm's late father. However, now he's back in Scotland to cater to his new laird. Malcolm introduces his uncle to Henry. Uncle Mac vows to catch up with them at the Tinchel. But first, he must tend to something more salient. Next, at Leoch, we see Colum chide Dougal. He urges his war chieftain brother to be on his best behavior at the Tinchel. All eyes will be on Clan Mackenzie. Ellen inserts herself into the conversation, reminding Dougal that if she can play her part, so can he. Uncle Mac barges into the great hall, demanding that he speak with Ellen alone. Once Colum and Dougal are out of the picture, Uncle Mac chats with Ellen for a spell about her upbringing, the rumors leveled against her, and her relationship with Malcolm. Uncle Mac threatens Ellen, asserting that if she breaks Malcolm's heart, he will rip hers out of her chest. Later, everyone arrives at Braar Castle for the Earl's Tinchel. Ellen and Malcolm walk among the tents, chatting about their grief over losing their fathers. Malcolm is glad to have Ellen's company here. Colum, Dougal, and Ned discuss the various lairds in attendance. Colum notes the presence of the Gallowglasses, who are formidable assassins. Dougal catches the eye of a lassie, but Colum sternly reminds him that there will be time for lassies later. Meanwhile, Brian spies Ellen with Malcolm. Murtagh remarks that it must hurt Brian to see his love with another man. Murtagh adds that he knows what Ellen endured regarding the purity test. He blames Brian for Ellen's tribulations. After this, Lovat asks Murtagh for an update about the Earl of Mar's impending announcement. Murtagh explains that the Earl plans to introduce a special, albeit unknown guest. Then, Henry spots Julia with baby William. He finally meets his son. However, their reunion is short-lived because Lovat interrupts. Julia makes an excuse for this Sassenach's appearance, claiming that Henry is an admirer of Simon. He knows the prophecy. Lovat introduces Julia as his wife. Henry's face falls. Clan Mackenzie makes a fashionable entrance before the Earl of Mar's meeting. Uncle Mac, Malcolm, and his crew chat about Colum and Dougal, essentially splitting the lairdship duties. The Earl of Mar introduces his special guest, Rob Roy McGregor. Rob makes his case for the Jacobite cause. It's high time that the Stuart name rises again, like a phoenix from the ashes. It's time to restore their true king to the throne. The Earl of Mar urges the lairds to think about whether they're a Jacobite or a loyalist. They will cast their votes during the Tinchel the following day. Lovat has his son on the brain and the prophecy that Maisry divined. He approaches the Earl of Mar, stating he will return with his heir to impart information that the latter will find most useful. However, Uncle Mac, who's no fan of Lovat, dunks on him something fierce. Seriously, how embarrassing for Lovat. Uncle Mac shares that Ellen's virtue was proven intact, so Lovat's casting aspersions failed spectacularly. Then, Rob approaches Dougal and asks about the money the latter pledged to the Jacobite cause on behalf of the Mackenzies. After this, Colum confronts Dougal privately. Dougal went behind his laird's back to conspire with outlaws. Dougal claims he's only concerned with the state of Scotland, not his own clan. Colum reminds Dougal that he swore fealty to him. Colum is the laird. He threatens to hire the Gallowglasses to cut Dougal's tongue out at the root should the latter betray him again. Then Colum notices that Dougal is withholding something else from him. What could it be? Elsewhere, Murtagh tries his hand at dancing while Brian and Ellen make googly eyes at each other. They watch two men arm wrestle and place their bets on who will win. Brian apologizes for Ellen's purity test. He's glad she's okay now. He tells her he loves her as they surreptitiously link hands. Ellen urges Brian to meet her later at the old kirk nearby. Next, Ellen reunites with Colum and Dougal before joining the Countess of Mar's sewing circle. Colum looks irate. Before Dougal gives them privacy, Ellen learns that her brother disclosed her secret. Dougal reminds Ellen that Colum is his laird. Colum is incredulous. How could Ellen foster a romance with a Fraser? Dougal wouldn't even go there with his frequent dalliances. Colum wonders if he should have Brian killed so Ellen will stay the course regarding her engagement to Malcolm. Ellen threatens to turn the Grants against the Mackenzies should Colum touch a hair on Brian's head. She has Malcolm's ear, after all. Colum vows to leave Brian alone if Ellen will uphold her end of the bargain and never see him again. Outside, Brian finds Henry and explains Julia's situation. Meanwhile, Julia and Ellen sit together during the sewing circle. Ellen learns that Julia was forced to marry Lovat. However, she really loves Henry, her true husband. Julia understands that marrying Lovat provides protection for herself, her child, and even Henry. It's important to do whatever is necessary to keep our loved ones safe, even if it hurts us. This gets the wheels turning in Ellen's head. So, Ellen meets Brian at the abandoned kirk. She breaks things off with him, claiming she doesn't love him anymore. Brian doesn't believe her. He knows her heart. It still beats for him, as does his for her. Still, Ellen remains unwavering in her resolve to cut ties. She leaves him there. We see her burst into tears in the aftermath. After this, Brian returns to his family's tent. Leoch demands to know where Brian was when Uncle Mac was embarrassing him in front of the other lairds. Fed up with his father's abuse and heartbroken by Ellen breaking up with him, Brian attacks Leoch. Leoch responds in kind as Beloch gets involved. Murtagh watches, his face awash with sympathy for Brian. Leoch deems Murtagh his representative in the impending Tinchel. Brian will be the beater. Later, Henry chats with Ned about the Grants' machinations. Arch watches them from afar. Henry reveals that Isaac and Arch lied to him about Julia and his son. They're alive and at Braar, but not well. He asks Ned for a favor. Could Ned help him, Julia, and William escape? Henry believes they need to leave before the Tinchel concludes. Ned replies that Arch will be at the hunt the following day. That would be the best time to flee. Then Henry asks for another favor, one that's significantly less risky. After this, we see Ned hand Julia a note from Henry, instructing her to meet him by the shore during the Tinchel. The following day, everyone prepares for the hunt. Malcolm chats with Ellen before the big event. Colum and Mrs. Fitz remark that Ellen is so lucky to marry such a gallant gent. Meanwhile, Brian fulfills his duty as the beater, smacking his shield to lure in the prey. Suddenly, an arrow whizzes past his head before landing in a tree. More arrows follow suit. Brian realizes he's being hunted. Someone hired the Gallowglasses to kill him. Thankfully, Murtagh saves his life. Murtagh insists that if someone's going to murder Brian, it will be him. Brian and Murtagh flee the woods to their horses. Elsewhere, Henry and Julia meet by the shore. Julia apologizes for the mess with Leoch. Henry shares that Brian explained everything. There's nothing to forgive. Beloch lurks nearby, though. Julia urges Henry to meet her outside Castle Leathers. She will leave a mark by the tree near the broken wall. Henry agrees to this. At the same time, the lairds meet to cast their vote regarding the Jacobite cause. Uncle Mac claims that Clan Grant is fully supportive of the Stuart king. The Earl of Mar and Rob realize they have an overwhelming amount of votes in support of the cause. The Earl of Mar steps outside with a flag, which he raises for James Edward Stuart, aka James VIII of Scotland and III of England, Ireland, and Wales. The crowd cheers. Suddenly, the finial falls off the flag, rolling down the hill. The audience grows silent. Is this an omen? A portent for what's to come? Malcolm pulls his uncle aside and scolds him for voting in favor of the Jacobites without consulting him. After all, Malcolm is the laird. Uncle Mac insists that lairds must act quickly and decisively. No dithering allowed, Malcolm sarcastically thanks Uncle Mac for his wise counsel. Then, Malcolm sees Ellen into her carriage, where Colum awaits. Malcolm is excited for his and Ellen's upcoming nuptials. Ellen smiles before taking her place beside Colum. They exchange charged glances before sitting in silence. 10th episode begins with a flashback to 1920. Henry, Julia, and Uncle Lamb are celebrating little Claire's second birthday. Lamb gives a toast to Claire, insisting she has the look of an adventurer. May her adventures take her far and wide, but she will always find her way home. At Castle Leoch, a woman in a light blue wedding gown walks slowly down the aisle in the main hall. A white veil covers her face. Then, we flash back to hours earlier that day. Brian complains about what Ellen told him at Braar when she broke up with him. Murtagh listens intently. Murtagh urges his cousin to forget Ellen's words. What did her eyes say? Brian replies that she's clearly still enamored with him. Murtagh claims that the love Brian and Ellen share is the stuff of legends. Suddenly, the Gallowglasses barrel into view. They attack Brian and Murtagh. One of them buries an arrow in Murtagh's leg. Brian takes out two of them before tying the last living Gallowglass to a tree. He slaps the dude around while demanding to know who hired him. The man finally discloses a name, Colum Mackenzie. Brian stabs the last Gallowglass through the heart. After briefly checking in on Murtagh, Brian makes a beeline for Castle Leoch. Meanwhile, Ellen and Mrs. Fitz walk through the main hall as folks flutter about them in decorating mode. Marcus McRannock approaches the pair. He wishes Ellen well on the day of her nuptials before offering her a gift. At the same time, Dougal has fun with a maid. Mora Grant, for whom said maid works, pops by to order her maid back to work. Dougal doesn't recognize Mora, who's Malcolm's sister, until she reintroduces herself. Then, Jocasta, Janet, and Mrs. Fitz help Ellen pack her belongings in her quarters. All those books are heading to Castle Grant now. Ellen mends fences with her sisters, particularly Jocasta. She apologizes for not consulting Jocasta before Red Jacob married her off to John Cameron. Jocasta looks touched by her sister's apology. Elsewhere in Castle Leathers, Lovat vents to Julia about the disrespect he faced at Braemar, courtesy of Uncle Grant. This will not stand. Julia urges Lovat not to pay Grant any mind. After all, per the prophecy, baby Simon will be the King of Scotland. Julia encourages Lovat to rest for a spell. Lovat orders Julia to head to his chambers. While Brian rides to Castle Leoch, Ellen has her hen party. She sits in a circle with Jocasta, Janet, Mrs. Fitz, Mora, and other women. They trade drinks and dirty bedroom stories. Mrs. Fitz tells the group that her husband claims she drives him wild. When it's Ellen's turn, she recites a tongue-twisting riddle. Jocasta attempts to recite the same riddle and fails. Mora calls Ellen out for the language she uses. As Malcolm's sister, she's protective of him. She wants his future wife to be worthy of him. Jocasta comes to Ellen's defense. After Mora leaves the circle, Ellen thanks Jocasta. Next, Julia bids farewell to Davina. Julia plans to grab William and rendezvous with Henry at their designated spot near the broken wall. She urges Davina to shout for Balak. Let Balak chase her and Henry. Then, when Lovat learns of what transpired, he will assume that Henry kidnapped Julia and William. This takes the heat off Davina. Julia flees the castle with William in her arms. Davina, still in the kitchen, shouts for Balak. As Julia reaches Henry, she quickly tells him that Balak will inevitably chase them. Sure enough, he's hot on their heels. Julia shouts for Balak, making it look like Henry's kidnapping her and William. Then, Henry knocks Balak unconscious with a rock before our trio scampers off. After this, Brian sneaks into Castle Leoch. Jocasta and Brian enter Ellen's chambers. Jocasta and Brian explain that Colum hired the Gallowglasses to kill him. Ellen realizes that her brother reneged on his end of the bargain. He promised her he wouldn't harm Brian. Ellen makes an executive decision. If Colum can go back on his word, then so can she. Mrs. Fitz shudders to think what would happen to Ellen if she doesn't marry Malcolm. But Ellen doesn't care. Later, Ellen chats with Colum in the latter's office. He gifts her with a fancy new quill and ink pot. He hopes they will correspond after Ellen moves in with Malcolm. Realizing her brother will never admit to breaking his promise, Ellen leaves it at that. At the same time, Henry, Julia, and William ride away from Castle Leathers. We see another flashback to 1923, shortly before our lovebirds inadvertently traveled through time. Henry and Julia sit on the deck of their beachfront house, watching 5-year-old Claire and Uncle Lamb play in the sand. Henry surprises Julia with tickets to Inverness for their fateful Scottish holiday. Julia surprises Henry in turn with her pregnancy. Back at Castle Leoch, we see a packed house for Ellen and Malcolm's wedding. However, Ellen's gone all runaway bride. An irate Malcolm listens as Colum and Ned inform him that Ellen has fled the scene. Colum tries to alleviate the tension in the room by suggesting that Ellen might return. Once she does, Colum will ensure she answers for her behavior. Malcolm insists that once Archbug retrieves his blade ear, the Mackenzies will pay. Uncle Grant steps in to speak for his nephew. He declares that heads will roll if they can't remedy the situation. After the younger and elder Grants depart, Colum orders Ned to get Dougal. It's high time Dougal fulfill his duty to Clan Mackenzie. And what is that duty, to be exact? We see the same faceless bride walking slowly down the aisle. Once she reaches the priest, she removes the veil. It's Mora Grant. The priest calls for the groom to step forward, Dougal Mackenzie. Malcolm sulks beside his uncle in the audience. After this, Jocasta and Mrs. Fitz fill Ellen and Brian in on the impromptu nuptials of Dougal and Mora. Jocasta and Mrs. Fitz will return for our lovebirds during the reception. Then they can escape unencumbered while everyone's distracted by drinking and dancing. Meanwhile, only Colum seems to truly look content among the bridal party. Colum delivers a hearty toast for the newlyweds. Mora proposes that she and Dougal make a beeline for their marital bed. Dougal obliges. Everyone cheers as they leave. Once upstairs, Mora asks Dougal how he would like to proceed. Dougal is overwhelmed. He didn't expect to end the day with a wife. Mora's ready to get down to business so they can return to the reception. Meanwhile, Mrs. Fitz and Jocasta return to Ellen and Brian to give them the go-ahead to leave. Ellen bids farewell to her sister and her maid. Elsewhere, Uncle Grant urges the Laird of Clan Grant to pull himself together. Malcolm is heartbroken. Uncle Grant advises Malcolm to exact revenge, make Ellen pay. Later, Brian and Ellen run into Malcolm on their way out. Malcolm takes his fury out on them both. He refuses to let them leave. Instead, Malcolm whips out his sword. Brian begs him to stand down. He doesn't want to fight Malcolm. However, Malcolm is seeing red, so Brian and Malcolm have it out in a skirmish. Unfortunately, it culminates in Malcolm's death. Brian stabs the Laird through the heart. After this, Brian drags Malcolm's body out of the way so he and Ellen can escape. Next, Ellen and Brian ride separate horses to Brian and Murtaugh's makeshift hideout. Murtaugh is pleased that they brought him food and alcohol. Ellen informs Murtaugh that Malcolm is dead. There will undoubtedly be fallout from this, and the shrapnel will strike them all. Later, Lovat and Davina search for Julia and William outside Castle Leathers. Davina lies, claiming she didn't see who kidnapped Julia. Balak did, though. Lovat curses Balak for getting knocked unconscious by a Sassenach. Lovat surmises that Henry, whom Julia dubbed Simon's admirer at Braemar, is behind the kidnappings. Archbug arrives with his crew, asking Lovat if he's seen a man. This confirms Lovat's suspicion that Henry is the kidnapper. Lovat attempts to join Arch in his search, stating that Henry stole his wife and son. Arch rejects the offer. He vows to bring Julia and Simon back to Lovat when he finds Henry. Meanwhile, Ellen tends to Brian's arm wound, courtesy of the late Malcolm. Later, Murtaugh tells Brian he's going hunting. He won't return until the morning at the latest. He's giving the happy couple some alone time. Ellen and Brian sit outside, basking in that post-coital glow. They're wrapped in Brian's tartan. After this, they bind themselves by blood, slicing cuts on each other's palms before reciting vows and clasping hands. Suddenly, they notice a plethora of burning crosses scattered across the highlands. Brian notes that it's a call to action for the clans. They must report to their lairds for battle. This signals the beginning of the Jacobite Rising of 1715. Brian adds that if one refuses the call, they face certain death. Ellen vows to support Brian, even as he heads into battle. Finally, Henry, Julia, and William arrive at Craignaddon. Henry hears the requisite buzzing emitting from the stones. Julia wonders if William can even pass through said stones. What if he's stuck here? Henry counters that time travel might be hereditary. He proposes that one of them should try to go through with William. If it turns out that William isn't a traveler, then the other will remain behind until the second person returns. Unfortunately, Arch and his crew are bounding up the hill to Craignaddon. In a split-second decision, Henry insists that Julia should go through with William. He tells Julia he loves her before they kiss. He grabs her arm, her palm out, and moves it toward one of the stones. But we don't know if she makes contact. We don't see if she and William travel forward successfully. In the final scene, we flash back to 1923. Julia and Henry bid farewell to Claire and Uncle Lamb on the train platform. Once aboard the train, the couple hangs out their window, waving to their daughter. Of course, they don't know that this will be the last time they see Claire.